Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back the Chairman of the Council on Competitiveness, Dr. Mahmood Khan, Chief Executive Officer of Life Biosciences.
Okay, I got to do what Chad was doing for a couple of minutes. But you know what? I don't have one log percentage point of his talent at pinch hitting. So where are you, Chad? Do you want to come back on and keep going? But we do understand Senator is in the building, so I don't have as long to go. While we're waiting, the question that was asked around the pre-competitive space, I think one of the comments we made and the points we made is the fact that we need to invest in the academic and national lab R&D system. All of the research, just about, done in our academic and national labs is pre-competitive. Well, let me, from here, go on to my real task. It truly is an honor for me to introduce today's keynote speaker, Senator Mark Warner, who truly embodies the mission of this council through his work on the Hill. Senator Warner is currently serving his second term representing the state of Virginia. Before he was elected to the Senate, Senator Warner served as governor of Virginia from 2002 to 2006. During this time, he vastly improved Virginia's business and education sector. As an example, when he left office in 2006, Virginia was ranked the best state for business, best managed state, and the best state to receive public education. Any one of those is a very impressive feat, but all three. Before he entered public office, Senator Warner spent 20 years in the private sector, specifically in technology and business development as an investor and entrepreneur. Perhaps most notably, he co-founded the company that eventually became Nextel. Now, I learned from some comments he made publicly that he was an entrepreneur even in college, and as a staffer, figured out ways to obtain food in plastic bags that even I at PepsiCo could not have figured out. So, certainly had early talents in entrepreneurship. Now in his second U.S. term, Senator Warner serves on the Senate Finance, Banking, Budget, and Rules Committee. He is also vice chairman on the Select Committee on Intelligence. I'm proud to introduce Senator Warner because he is a strong advocate of the Council and embraces the same core values that our Council is focused on. He has established himself as a bipartisan leader who works with both Democrats and Republicans to encourage job creation, government accountability, and innovation. Through his bipartisan work, he's been recognized by many as an advocate for tackling our country's debt as well as fighting for our military men and women and veterans. Please join me in giving Senator Warner a warm welcome round of applause. Welcome, Senator.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for that very kind introduction. I think this may be the first time I've spoken to the council since I was a governor, and in that ensuing number of years, I've had to use glasses now, so I apologize on the front end. I also want to apologize in that while most of the action is going on in the House today, we are actually plowing through a number of judges, and I'm going to be a little bit limited in that I have to give my presentation and not go through the question and answer period, which frankly I would have rather almost flipped that because I think the question period is sometimes more significant. But I do appreciate this opportunity to speak to the Council on Competitiveness, and I'm hopeful I'll have a chance to continue this dialogue because I think this conversation in this issue is the issue of our time. So what I'm going to talk about today is U.S.-China Relationship and maintaining the United States' competitive edge. I think today there is a widespread understanding that addressing a rising China is the great foreign policy challenge of our time. So again, this could not be a more important time or a more important conversation. I believe we can and must retain our leadership and global competitive advantage by embracing those defining characteristics that have made America the leader of the free world. Our belief in the rule of law, checks and balances, free and open markets, justice, diversity, human rights, and ultimately, the rights of an individual, especially when those rights come in conflict with the government. Those values are the foundation, and I don't think we focus on this enough, but those basic American values have been the foundation of our international success, and in most ways, the foundation of our strongest alliances. But today, China is offering a different model to the world. Let's all acknowledge it has achieved meteoric rise, but it's done so while rejecting those core values that has made, I think, not only America, but the West strong. And I want to make one thing clear at the outset. My beef is with President Xi Jinping and the Communist Party of China, not by any means the great contributions of Chinese Americans, or for that matter, the Chinese people. And I think it's terribly important at this moment in time that we, whether we're in business or in politics, stand with the people of Hong Kong as they struggle for their freedoms. I fear that the Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party, is intent on reshaping the norms and values that have underwritten the decades of global stability, security, and prosperity. Now, until recently, let me say that I was part of that conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom told us that the United States and China would rise together, two nations intertwined in partnerships in trade, business, and education. And like many, I hoped, and I remember leading a trade delegation to China as governor, I hoped that China's greater global integration would lead to a more open, prosperous, and potentially more democratic China, and that a rising China would be good for the world. Today, I believe it is clear that the aims of President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party do not align with that vision. The party is making a play for dominance in all of the advanced 21st century technology arenas: 5G, AI, quantum, robotics, biotech, areas like payments. They are already the world's leader. But they're doing this not on a traditional market-based fair playing field. The party instead is exploiting all elements of state power to strengthen China's position globally, using cyber attacks to steal economic and military secrets, modernizing and expanding its own military presence, and waging influence campaigns, some open but many covert, to shape perceptions of China while undermining human rights, dignity, and free speech. It acts in an interventionist and unilateral way, continuing, and more so in the last few years, to reject core principles around transparency, reciprocity, rule of law, and the free market. The CCP, I actually believe, exploits, and depending on where it positions itself, sometimes tries to say, oh, China is a market-based system, and exploits the opportunities of an open market, while at the same time increasing barriers to foreign companies coming into China and massively subsidizing its own Chinese champions on the international market. And what it can't out-innovate, the CCP has no reservations about stealing through cyber theft and espionage. Foreign competitors have often unwittingly, although more so with certain of their actions, maybe not so unwittingly, assisted Beijing in these efforts. It has become extremely common for the CCP to force foreign companies into joint ventures with Chinese companies or require them to share source codes and other IP in order just to get into the Chinese market, sacrifices that companies would not make to gain access to any other marketplace in the world. And once that IP and source code is in China, that is often taken, stolen, and then used by the Chinese state to modernize Chinese military under a state-directed policy that they call civil civil-military fusion. The government there continues to view Western universities and government labs as a fertile background for the transfer of sensitive research back to China and for spreading false narratives favorable to the Chinese Communist Party. What's particularly alarming, and we've seen enormous evidence of this recently, is that it sees Chinese expats, especially students and academics, as essential assets in those state-run efforts. Let me be clear, 363,000 Chinese students in American universities, all paying 100 cents on the dollar, full tuition, most of them great, great students. And my concern is not with the vast majority of these students who come here with the opportunity to learn and also benefit our country and the world at large. But my concern is what has changed in the last 3 years, the last 5 years with these students. America is not by any means as open and immigrant-friendly as it used to be. There are obviously, China is a much more attractive place to go back to for students. But the third, and the most damaging and potentially devastating, is that the Chinese spy services increasingly are threatening families of students who are doing advanced research, not only in America, but in the West, threatening their families if their sons and daughters, after they complete their studies, don't come home and bring a thumb drive full of IP. These behaviors are not just a challenge to the United States, but to all nations committed to democracy, transparency, and rule of law. So what do? I think we need a comprehensive global strategy focusing on competing with China in the 21st century. Now, I'm not here to advocate that we go back to some kind of bilateral Cold War approach where we try to break the world into two halves. Given China's size, its integration into the economic order and the world order, 2/3 of all the nations in the world, their top trading partner is already China. And global threats we face, from climate change to regional threats like North Korea, there are going to have to be areas where we continue to cooperate. But we should do that with eyes wide open. So what do? Defensive. First, we should quickly take actions to protect ourselves. The United States government must increase efforts to protect our critical supply chains, to increase export controls of critical and dual-use technologies, to limit Chinese investments in sensitive and critical technologies, and to ensure that the Chinese government and other bad actors cannot continue to hide those investments in anonymous shell companies through beneficial ownership reform. We know, and we hear this, particularly I hear this from my role as vice chair on the Intel Committee, we know that China is using on a regular basis dark money to buy influence in Australia, Taiwan, increasingly other nations in Asia. So making sure we have financial transparency in this country around beneficial ownership is critical. But the federal government can't tackle this challenge alone. For example, over the last year and a half, I got so frustrated with the Intel briefings that changed my views and, frankly, uniform both through the end of the Obama administration and throughout the Trump administration, nothing partisan on this, that laid out in an absolutely unanimous way the threat and challenge that China poses on a whole host of fronts. Finally, I got so frustrated with the Intel community saying simply terrorizing the 15 members of the Intelligence Committee is not sufficient if we can't get some of this information into academic world, the business world, and other parts of our society. So as a former business guy, I've basically been doing road shows over the last year and a half, always with a Republican colleague, always with either the Director of National Intelligence or his deputy, FBI, DHS, and others, where we give those outside government in a classified setting an inside view of what we see in terms of these challenges. Now, I think these dozen plus, and we have more to do, of these so-called road shows, I think ends up where we both walk out with shared awareness, and I hope for the folks who come from academia, VC world, BRT, telecom, we've hit many sectors, we've done some of these around the country, with the exception of private equity, who unfortunately has been unwilling to hear this story so far. We've walked out of those sessions with a shared awareness and increased sense of urgency that companies and universities need to fortify their own systems against cyber threats and insider threats. We need to do a better job protecting our research and development, especially the critical work at United States universities and research labs. Universities should and must double down on security and compliance. For example, requirements that already exist that have been ignored for too many years on faculty members disclosing additional sources of income or affiliations with foreign military and intelligence organizations to better address potential conflicts of interest. And we've seen continually, as an aside, the number of faculty members who say, well, I wondered why XYZ professors were always being offered these all-expense trips paid to go to China and lecture for a while. If that is not a flashing red sign to be careful, you can't limit faculty members' travel, but at least have conversations about what they may be getting into, then we're not doing our job. Now again, these measures must be enforced pragmatically and transparently so they don't discriminate against the people they seek to protect. The goal here is not only to protect our research, but to help students and researchers, Chinese and otherwise, avoid being preyed upon by the Communist Party. Although I have to acknowledge that I have become increasingly disturbed that United States businesses and academic communities have deepened their partnerships with China for short-term gain while failing to take into account long-term costs. If I hear one more business leader, particularly Fortune 500 business leaders, say, well, Senator, I get this problem, but we can't miss the Chinese market. And I only say at what cost? Today, we've seen American investors pour money into state-backed Chinese companies that advance China's military capabilities. We've seen United States companies, some of our most prominent, develop technologies that directly enable the Chinese Communist Party's censorship, surveillance, and social control efforts in a way, in a system that, if I had more time, is almost Orwellian in nature. And what's worse is that this ability for China to develop these surveillance technologies, which currently are mostly focused on their own people, but they've taken this as another tool that they can then export to other authoritarian regimes, where China can offer not only their version of a better top-down market-based system, but also the notion of saying, you want to be able to control your dissidents? We can offer you a technology-based solution that will rock your socks. One stark example of this is the CCP's, I believe, inhumane treatment of the Uyghur population. I recently joined with Senator Cornyn on the Uyghur Protection Act, which would place export controls on technologies that provide that critical capability for the Chinese Communist Party to monitor whether it's Uyghurs in Western China or protesters in Hong Kong. So we'd look at additional restrictions on technology around, for example, facial recognition software, which constantly is being used to increase mass surveillance efforts. We also, and I say this as somebody who spent a career in telecom before I got into politics, we need to get very serious very quickly because we are behind in securing our telecommunications networks when it comes to 5G. And for those of you who are not telecom nerds in the room, 5G, which we hear a lot talking about, is the equivalent in the old days of moving from radio to television. It will have that much of a transformative effect on our economy as virtually all of the Internet of Things devices will ride on a 5G network. So far, the United States has failed to find that consensus with our international colleagues and allies on how we deal with a company like Huawei that's beholden to the Communist Party of China rather than its shareholders, its management, or its board. I think for too long we tried to point out, well, our friendly nations around the world say, well, show me the back door in Huawei equipment today. That's not the issue. The issue is if you become reliant upon a Chinese sole competitor that offers a full stack solution in 5G, and a system that increasingly is going to be software-driven, at any point in the future, the Communist Party in China can make sure that malware that comes into your system could actually have devastating effects in terms of your people being spied upon. And there's increasingly not an intelligence agency around the Western world that doesn't acknowledge that. It's increasingly, so we've got to have this 5G strategy. I've joined by a number of my colleagues, have pressed by the administration, and they are getting their act together on this, to appoint a 5G top-down person so we can build this international coalition of companies around the world. Huawei already is going to get close to half the market no matter what we do, starting this far behind. This is the first time, literally since Sputnik, since we are behind on a leading-edge technology. However, defensive measures only go so far. We've got to make sure that we out-innovate China on an ongoing basis. For instance, let me go back to 5G. We cannot simply say we're going to try to keep 5G. We can keep Huawei out of U.S. networks, but chances are it's not going to be kept out of other networks. I see the hook, but I'm going to, if I miss this vote, I want to make sure I get the last of these comments in. The price, and the thing is here, and this is an important point, I'll try to speed this up, is that generally in the past, and this group knows it more than most, we have always thought, even if it's not invented in America, we, by the size of our market, and in an open competitive marketplace, if we can out-innovate, we'd win the long-term battle. We're seeing, in the case of 5G, I think the first example of what may be the new model in the 21st century, where China basically has good technology, whether they acquired it, stole it, or developed it, back a national champion, and then go out to the marketplace. And if we expect to have a market-based solution against a company that is, in a sense, sponsored by China, this 5G market over the next 3 to 5 years, about $75 billion in equipment to be purchased. China's put up a $100 billion fund to back Huawei. So the notion that any company, and we don't even have an American competitor in this space, can go against that kind of enterprise on price when Huawei can cut their price with good equipment and offer 140% financing, that is a challenge that we can't solve on our own. So one of the things I believe we need to look at are how we start thinking about international technology alliances. 5G is being the starting point, but whatever we do, and there will be needs for a level of government involvement and support unlike anything we've seen in modern times. This country is going to have to start thinking about terms like industrial policy in ways that we've not thought about in the last 50 years. The good news is I think there is broad-based consensus across the American political spectrum that this may be the time and the issue that brings us together. There is also a growing recognition amongst, and a lot of this was driven initially by Japan, Korea, Australia, as they saw these Chinese influences across the West, that we're going to have some level of international cooperation to take on this challenge. Whatever we do in 5G, where we're behind, we need to be careful about how we think about it, because we will see and face the same level of competition in artificial intelligence, in quantum computing, increasingly in biotech, posing us a level of threat and a level of need for solution sets that we've not seen before. I recently suggested if we go ahead and issue some new spectrum, we ought to take the lead in America in making sure that we actually push towards what would be the next iteration beyond 5G, so-called ORAN, Open Radio Access Network, where actually the West can be more competitive because we will be moving towards a more software-based solution. One example of a problem, but also hopefully a solution set. And we've proposed, if there is some of this additional spectrum that's being auctioned off, that we need to make sure that we put aside some of those funds, public funds, to promote ORAN, that if we have to take out some of the Huawei equipment on some of our domestic smaller telco carriers, which, by the way, if you ever looked at the map of where Huawei sold equipment and where our ICBMs are located, you'll almost see a complete overlap. If we have to think about changing out some of that equipment, we need to make sure that we build towards a next generation solution. So I do think this notion of a tech alliance or an alliance of the willing may have to be a whole new framework that we've thought about in a military sense, we've thought about in an economic sense, but increasingly I think we're going to have to think about in a technology sense. And that goes across R&D, it goes across supply chain issues, it goes across how we make sure that the technology of the 21st century that will drive the economy are based in the values that I think built our country in the first place and allowed our economy to prosper in so many ways in that post-World War II environment. And the truth is, we're also going to have to finally recognize that our public level of investment, if we're going to make this happen, is going to have to go dramatically up. At the end of World War II, the United States funded 69% of all the R&D in the world. Today, we fund about 28%, and only 7% of that is non-defense related. That is not a business plan for success against a country in the sense of China that's laid out in their China 2025 plan the technologies they believe they will dominate in that will lead, I believe, towards economic and additional dominance if they're able to carry that out. So it's extraordinarily important that we get this right. I had a lot of other really important things to say, but since no rest for the weary in terms of voting schedule, I will leave it at that. I would hope to the council folks that I get invited back so that hopefully I provoked you a little bit and you could say, well, I agree with this, I don't agree with that. Senator Warner, let's get at it. I do think this is the issue of our time. And in a strange way, when we see my day job right now seeming so divided in our country on partisan and other bases, I want to leave you with, in a sense, what may be a good news piece, and that is I've found from the business community, I've found even from the academic community over the last 2 years, I can tell you from the political world, this is a world where there is a growing, huge consensus. What we've not had is that plan on how we get it right. To get it right, we're going to need you, we're going to need policymakers, we're going to need academia to all put our heads together, and we're going to have to do it not just on an American-based opportunity, but frankly, with democracies around the world. I hope I can be part of that solution set. I know we're going to need you in that struggle as well. Thank you all very much.